Welcome back to Sleepy Lorekeeper. Tonight, we drift into a kind of childhood that the galaxy rarely remembers. A childhood measured not in years, but in the slow crumbling of fragile bones. A childhood lived under a sun that hated the people born beneath it. A childhood that never learned the meaning of growing older because almost no one ever did. Tonight, we drift into the early life of a Necrontyr. There are histories that describe the Necrontyr as bitter, cruel, and ravenous for vengeance. Entire chronicles speak of a people whose envy devoured their better nature. But those records begin far too late. They remember only the fall and never the beginning. They recall the cities of living metal, the undying armies, the cold machine mines. They forget the years before all of that. They forget that the Necrontyr were once alive. I was born on a world that felt old even when I opened my eyes for the first time. A world wrapped in skeletal spires and horizon lines blurred by storms of irradiated sand. The skies were always pale, as if color itself had been burned away long before my birth. The light of our dying sun poured down with the faint cruelty of a patient executioner. It did not lash out in bursts or storms. It killed quietly, slowly, every day, the way erosion wears down a continent. My earliest memory is a strange one. I remember brightness, not the warm brightness of a healthy star, but a harsh, white glare that settled in my bones and made my skin ache. When I was a child, I thought that all sunlight hurt. I had no reason to believe otherwise. Every child I knew felt the same burning weight. Every family built their homes beneath shielding fields or deep within cavernous structures to hide from the ray that poisoned our blood. My people were born under a star that despised us. I remember lying in a medical cradle only days after I was born. Thin bands of shimmering light hummed softly above me. They were meant to filter the worst of the radiation. They helped, but not much. The healers wore hollow masks to hide their own sickly skin. Their eyes were always tired. Every infant of our species was examined with a kind of weary resignation. They checked our bones for early brittleness. They scanned our blood for genetic decay. They looked at our lungs and hearts as if they were sand sculptures waiting for the tide. No Necrontyr child was born whole. Not truly. We entered the world already marked. My parents tried to create hope where none existed. I remember the faint scent of the nutrient leaves my mother cultivated in a shaded alcove. She would sit with me there during the cooler hours when the sun dipped behind the towers. She told me stories about the great cities of our ancestors, cities that once stretched across continents before they retreated underground. She spoke with reverence, but behind it, I always sensed fear. She knew the truth. Everyone did. Our bodies were not made to last. They never had been. My father was quieter. He moved with the careful steps of someone who expected his bones to crack at any moment. He had lived longer than most. That alone made him something like a miracle. Every movement he made carried the sound of someone balancing between living and breaking. He would sit beside me as I rested in my cot, tracing small patterns in the metal floor with a trembling finger. Sometimes he would pause as if searching for a word he no longer remembered, or as if the act of remembering drained what strength he had left. He once told me that he was proud I had survived my first year. Many children did not. The healer said my condition was mild compared to others. Mild meant that I could walk for short stretches before exhaustion forced me to sit. Mild meant that I could go outside for a minute or two beneath the weak shielding of my home's outer canopy. Mild meant that when the coughing fits came, they left only faint streaks of blood instead of a flood. Mild meant that my parents allowed themselves to hope in quiet moments when they thought I could not see. But even a mild life on Necrontyr was a race against a clock that had already started counting down. No one pretended otherwise. Life was short, childhood was shorter, and the horizon was always waiting. The first time I saw the sky without shielding, I was 4 years old. My mother carried me to the upper terrace during one of the rare cooling days when clouds drifted over the city. She pointed toward the faint sphere of our star behind the gray. People say stars are symbols of warmth and life. I never understood that. Ours was a vast white wound in the sky. Even clouded, it felt like a weight pressing on the world. I asked her why the star hurt us. She closed her eyes as though searching for a way to explain a curse no one truly understood. She told me that long ago, when our species first arose, the world had been different. Perhaps the star had been gentler. Perhaps our bodies had been stronger. But time had twisted both. The sun weakened and then lashed out in slow punishment. Radiation seeped into the planet's skin and into ours. Generation after generation grew sicker. We lived beneath the shadow of a celestial execution. Her voice trembled when she said that. I did not realize it then, but I understand now. She was mourning a child who was still alive. That was common on Necrontyr. Families grieved early. Hope was fragile, and love always carried the certainty of loss. Most children died before reaching adulthood. The oldest among us rarely lived to see 30. For a species with such brilliance and ambition, the cruelty of such a short life was unbearable. I learned to walk in the long corridors of our dwelling, balancing my hands against the cold alloy walls. Every few steps, my legs would tremble, and I would rest again. My parents encouraged me gently. They never pushed. They knew that pushing could break me. I could feel their quiet pride when I managed to cross a room, unaided. To another species, it might have been a trivial achievement. To us, it was a victory against the star. As I grew, I became aware of the funerary processions that moved silently through the lower streets. They did not disturb me. Death was not a stranger in my city. It walked beside us as a companion. The dead were carried with solemn reverence to the inner chambers beneath the towers, where their bodies were sealed in crystal vaults. There was no time for elaborate mourning. Grief was a steady rhythm, like breathing. I remember asking why the dead were kept so carefully if life was so short. My father told me that our ancestors preserved knowledge through memory stones etched with the impressions of neural patterns. The bodies did not matter. The lives did. Each vault was a library of thoughts, stored so that our brief-lived people might still leave something behind. I found comfort in that, even if I did not survive long. Perhaps something of me could remain. When I was 5, I met another child named Serac. He lived in the same Hab cluster. His skin was paler than mine, almost translucent. We played together in the narrow hallways where the shielding fields made the air feel thicker than usual. He had a quiet laugh, short and soft, as though he feared using too much oxygen. We spent our days building small lattice toys from magnetic shards and watching the storm fronts pass. Neither of us could run. Neither of us had the strength. But we could imagine, and sometimes that was enough. Serac's illness worsened before he turned 6. His bones grew brittle to the point that the healers could not stabilize them. He vanished from our hallway one evening. I was told he had gone to the inner chambers to rest. That was the Necrontyr way of saying he had died. I remember sitting alone, with our half-finished toy scattered on the floor, and feeling something hollow open inside me. I did not cry. Our bodies struggled even with that, but the ache stayed. A quiet void that settled where joy should have been. It was the first time I understood that childhood on Necrontyr was not a chapter of life. It was an illness shared by everyone too young to break. Still, we tried to live. Our schools were structured not around years, but around bursts of ability. On days when we could stand and walk, we listened to lessons about the old dynasties and the sciences our ancestors had mastered. On days when pain forced us to lie still, we watched flickering holodiagrams projected above our cradles. The teachers spoke with gentle determination, knowing that only a few students would survive long enough to reach their full curriculum. They taught us everything as quickly as possible. They did not believe in waiting. Time was never a luxury. Some days I could hear distant arguments between scholars and nobles. They spoke of the old ones, the ancient beings whose lifespans stretched into eternity. They spoke of envy and injustice. They spoke of a universe that favored some species and condemned others. Even as a child, I could feel the bitterness in their voices. Our bodies betrayed us. Our world cursed us. And the galaxy ignored us. I did not hate the old ones then. I did not understand enough to hate. I only knew that their images in the educational holos showed tall, healthy forms untouched by decay. They seemed to float like living myths. I remember studying one of the holos for a long time and whispering a quiet wish that my people could be like that too. Strong, ageless, free. The healers often spoke of a grand search led by the greatest minds of our species. They sought cures for our genetic decay. They built laboratories and ventured into the deepest caverns of our planet to escape the sun's poison. They experimented with shielding, nanite therapies, genetic reconstruction. None of it worked. The sickness in our species was too deeply woven. Our star had carved its signature into every cell of our bodies, and no tool could erase it. I remember sitting in one of those clinics as a child, breathing through a mask that hummed with filtration fields. The healers pricked my skin with soft, light needles that felt like bursts of cold. They murmured to each other in tones that carried both resignation and hope. I watched their hands move with careful precision. Knowing they had performed the same procedures countless times on children just like me, they tried to ease our suffering, but they could not stop the slow erosion of life. As I grew older, the world around me began to feel heavier. The storms intensified. Radiation readings rose. More funerary processions wound their way through the streets each month. Entire neighborhoods seemed to empty as families retreated deeper underground. The air tasted faintly metallic, as though the planet itself was beginning to decay alongside us. And yet, for all the sickness and despair, there were moments of quiet beauty. I remember evenings when the storms cleared and thin streaks of silver clouds drifted across the bruised sky. My mother would carry me to the viewing platform on those rare nights. We would watch the faint glow of distant constellations shimmer through the haze. She would tell me that even though our star hated us, the universe was vast and full of places untouched by such cruelty. I did not know if she believed that. Perhaps she wanted me to believe it, so that my short life could carry some fragile spark of wonder. I clung to those moments. They were fragile, like the bones in my arms, but they were mine. As I neared my 7th year, the healers spoke in quiet tones when examining me. Their voices dropped lower each visit. My lungs no longer responded as they once had. My bones carried the early signs of softening. My heart struggled with irregular rhythms. I listened without fear. Fear was a luxury my people rarely allowed ourselves. We accepted the shadow of death the way others accept the rising of the sun. It was simply part of who we were. But beneath acceptance, something deeper stirred in the minds of our leaders. It spread slowly at first, like a whisper carried through the high halls of the dynasties. A whisper that promised an end to pain, an end to sickness, an end to the shortness of our lives. I did not understand it then. I only felt its presence in the strained glances exchanged between my parents, in the unusual gatherings of nobles, in the hushed words spoken by healers behind closed doors. Something was changing, something immense, something irreversible. And in the midst of that unease, I began to hear a single word more often than any other. a word carried on the breath of scientists and priests alike, a word spoken in hope by some and in fear by others. Biotransference. I did not know what it meant, not yet. But even as a child, I could feel that my world was approaching its final dawn. I did not learn the meaning of the word biotransference quickly. It drifted through my childhood like a cold breeze through the corridors, never explained, never defined, only felt. Children were rarely told truths on Necrontyr, not because adults wished to deceive us, but because so little of our lives stretched far enough to make explanations meaningful. We lived in the shadow of a dying star. We were born into an inheritance of sickness. Our questions often ended in quiet glances, and a hand rested gently on our shoulder. Answers felt like luxuries meant for people who had time. Even so, I listened. Children notice the tones that adults try to hide. They feel tension like a shifting gravity. They hear fear wrapped in the shallow breaths of their elders. And around the word biotransference, fear gathered like storm clouds. The first time I understood that something immense was approaching came during a lesson in one of the inner learning halls. I remember lying in a reclined support cradle, ribs aching as I shifted to see the hollow projector above me. A teacher spoke softly, her voice steady despite the faint tremor betraying her weakness. She was older than most educators, perhaps in her mid-20s, which on Necrontyr made her something close to a legend. Her skin bore the familiar gray pallor of radiation exposure. Her hair had thinned into a delicate, shimmering veil. Every breath she took sounded deliberate, as if she were negotiating with her failing lungs. She told us about the dynastic houses of ancient Necrontyr. She described towering cities built before the star began its long descent into lethality. She spoke of a time when our people believed they were on the cusp of greatness, when scientific breakthroughs were celebrated every season, when life was still long enough to carry ambition across generations. But as she spoke, I watched her eyes drift. She paused longer than usual between sentences. She glanced toward the upper balcony, where higher-ranking administrators often observed our lessons. She searched their expressions as though waiting for some signal, some affirmation, some permission to continue. Then she told us something unexpected. She said that progress, true progress, had ended long before our own births, that every innovation since then had been but a desperate attempt to preserve what little time our bodies allowed us, that entire fields of study existed solely to slow the decay within us, and that all of it had failed. She did not say it with bitterness. She said it with the calm resignation that defines a species that has fought for millennia against an enemy that lived in their very cells. Her lesson shifted toward the old ones. Not their triumphs, but their longevity. Their baffling ability to endure cosmic ages untouched by disease or decay. Their mastery of sciences that seemed to defy the laws our ancestors understood. Even as a child, hearing about a race that never feared the ticking of mortality felt like listening to a cruel fairy tale. I wondered aloud what it would feel like to breathe without pain, to grow older without fear, to outlive the storms of our world. My question lingered in the air. The class was silent. The teacher looked at me for a long time before answering. She told me that our people once believed the universe to be a place of promise. That discovery brought hope, that new worlds brought possibility. But when we met the old ones, that hope collapsed beneath the weight of comparison. Standing before immortals, our weaknesses grew impossible to ignore. I did not understand the sorrow in her voice until much later. In the days that followed that lesson, I noticed changes in the city. Cryptek seers walked the streets more frequently, their long metallic augmentations reflecting the faint light of the shielding fields. Priests of the Triarch moved with urgent purpose between towers. Processions of nobles traveled under escort into deep sanctums, normally reserved for the most sacred rites of our people. Even the storms felt wrong. They came sooner, heavier, carrying charged particles that made my skin prickle. Some nights the clouds glowed with a sickly blue that seeped into my dreams. One evening, the shielding field above our dwelling flickered for several seconds. The moment the field dropped, I felt the unmistakable sting of radiation on my skin. It was like standing too close to a furnace, even though the air remained cold. I remember my mother rushing to wrap me in layered shielding cloths. Her hands trembled, not with illness, with fear. After that, I noticed her watching me more often, not with the gentle pride that had filled her eyes in my earliest memories, but with the gaze of someone counting days. Every time I coughed, her breath paused. Every time my legs trembled, her fingers tightened around whatever she held. She knew what was coming. She had seen it in others. She expected it to come for me soon. Despite her fear, she tried to give me small moments of comfort. On days when my body allowed it, she carried me to the upper terrace to watch the horizon. From there, I could see the outer towers that stretched like skeletal fingers into the sky. Their surfaces were etched with runes meant to shield us from the sun, though by then the inscriptions were more ceremonial than effective. The light found its way through every barrier eventually. I loved watching the towers. Their shapes held a cold beauty. They reminded me of what our civilization had been before the star betrayed us. They stood as monuments to ambition, crafted by hands that had once believed in a future they would never see. As I grew into my 8th year, something shifted within me. Childhood itself seemed to dissolve. My people did not have the luxury of slow development. Awareness came early. Mortality pressed close. I began to read the expressions of the adults around me with unsettling clarity. I noticed the way healers avoided meeting my parents' eyes during examinations. I noticed the way my father paused before answering even simple questions, choosing his words like someone navigating a minefield of unspoken truths. And still, there was that word. Biotransference. I asked my father what it meant once, but he simply placed a hand on my shoulder and told me it was something I did not need to worry about. The way he said it made the air feel heavier around me. I sensed he was protecting me from knowledge that would darken my thoughts, as if my thoughts were not already steeped in the awareness of my own fragility. The more adults avoided the topic, the more it dominated hushed conversations. Entire families gathered during the low-light hours, whispering about rumors carried from the upper chambers of the dynasties. Some spoke of salvation, some spoke of doom. Others spoke of choices that had been made on behalf of the entire species without the consent of those who would bear the consequences. One night, I woke to the low hum of machinery vibrating through the foundation of our home. The entire district trembled. People emerged into the corridors, leaning on walls for support. The lights flickered. I felt a strange pulse beneath my feet, as if the planet itself were exhaling. It continued for several long moments. When it finally stopped, the silence that followed felt wrong, heavy, expectant. The following morning, tall structures appeared at the edge of the city. They rose from the ground like metallic monoliths, each one crowned with intricate crystal lattice conduits. I had never seen anything like them. No child had. No adult had either, for that matter. These were new, not relics of our past, but constructions of our present desperation. Cryptex oversaw their assembly. Their augmented silhouettes were unmistakable, each one draped in layered robes woven with shimmering nanofilaments. They moved with a precision that felt otherworldly, as though their bodies no longer obeyed the typical rhythms of flesh. Their voices echoed through the city, carrying instructions to workers, who already appeared exhausted by the intensity of their tasks. My mother watched the structures with a troubled stare. She told me quietly that she had seen similar devices during her youth, when the dynasties first began experimenting with transference of consciousness. I had never heard of such attempts. I did not yet understand that those early experiments had failed disastrously. She did not tell me that part. The atmosphere in the city changed further when emissaries of the Silent King arrived. Their armored forms were imposing even at a distance. They carried with them the solemn authority of a ruling lineage that had endured countless cycles of death and renewal. Their presence was a sign, something significant, something irreversible had been decided. The Silent King's decrees rarely reached children, but this one did. Not with words, but with the reactions it invoked. The moment the emissaries were seen, people began gathering belongings. Some packed enough to last a journey. Others packed nothing at all. Many simply stood motionless, as if waiting for someone to explain the weight they felt pressing into their thoughts. That night, I felt something I had never experienced before. A sense of quiet dread that pulsed like a second heartbeat. The air felt too thin, as though the city had forgotten how to breathe. Even the shielding fields seemed to flicker with uncharacteristic instability, casting the walkways in shifting patterns of light and shadow. When dawn came, my parents stood in silence beside the upper terrace railing. They gazed out at the horizon as if searching for hope. but the horizon offered only the familiar glare of our hateful star. My father's hand rested gently on my shoulder. His touch felt heavier than usual. For a long moment, none of us spoke. Then he turned me toward the city, toward the new monoliths, toward the gathering crowds, toward the future he knew I would not understand. He told me that the Silent King had chosen a path for our people, that the curse of our star had reached a point where no cure could be found, that our species was dying too quickly, collapsing under the weight of its own fragility, that the scientists, the priests, and the rulers had all agreed on a single solution. The word echoed once more: Biotransference. I felt the sound of it settle into my chest like a cold seed. I was not afraid, not yet. I did not know what I was meant to fear. But as the city prepared for what was coming, as the air filled with a strange mixture of sorrow and anticipation, as whispers of sacrifice intertwined with whispers of hope, I began to sense that childhood itself was ending. Not just mine, all of ours. Something vast was approaching. Something that would rewrite our species. Something that would reach into our bones, into our minds, into the deepest places of our identity. And as the first preparations began, as families gathered in somber lines leading toward the towering structures that had risen overnight, I understood, without being told, that whatever biotransference was, it marked the end of the world I had known, the end of a dying species, the end of children who never had the chance to grow old, the end of us. I remember the morning when the city changed forever. There are moments in life that carve themselves into your memory with absolute clarity, even when nothing else remains. This was one of them. I was still a child, barely past my 8th year. My bones ached before I even opened my eyes. The air felt heavier than usual, as if the entire world were holding its breath. When I stepped onto the upper terrace with my parents, the horizon was swallowed by haze. Not the familiar storms of irradiated dust, but something thicker, something metallic, something alive. Towering shapes rose from the plains beyond the city, shadows that looked like colossal monuments built overnight. Their surfaces reflected the pale light of our dying sun in fractured patterns that made them appear to pulse with a slow, steady rhythm. They did not look like the shelters we had always built to hide from the star. They looked like temples designed for something far older and far more patient than any living being. My mother held her cloak tighter across her chest. I could feel the tension through her fingertips. My father stood behind us, silent, unmoving. I could sense that his thoughts were not on the towers, but on the decision that had brought them there. The Silent King had spoken. His decree spread across the planet like a shiver through bone. The time had come to abandon the fragile lives we had been given, to shed the weakness that had shaped our existence, to become something new, something strong, something unbound by the cruelty of our sun. I watched the people of the city gather in the streets below. Lines formed with slow, uncertain steps. Families clutched small bundles of personal belongings, as if they believed that something from their former lives might survive the transition. Elderly citizens leaned heavily on walking supports. Children were carried in trembling arms. The sickest among us were borne on floating platforms that hummed like muted lamentations. There were no protests, no cries of outrage, no rebellion. The Necrontyr had been dying for so long that the promise of escape, no matter how distant or abstract, was enough to silence doubt. Still, there was fear. Deep, quiet, and unspoken. We descended into the streets to join the flow of bodies. The shielding fields above flickered again, briefly exposing the crowd to the sting of radiation. A faint ripple of discomfort moved through the people, but no one turned back. The path forward felt inevitable. The closer we came to the towering monoliths, the more their presence dominated my senses. They were not simple structures. They were conduits of power. Their surfaces were etched with runic channels that glowed faintly, as though energy flowed through them in slow, deliberate pulses. Their design seemed both ancient and new, familiar yet impossible. They were shaped like something from our ancestral memories, but constructed with technologies we could barely comprehend. Cryptex guided the crowds with gestures and measured steps. Their augmented forms moved with a precision that felt alien. Their limbs were elongated by metallic reinforcements. Their faces were hidden behind veils of crystalline circuitry. They did not speak. They communicated with faint pulses of light from the devices attached to their chests. Those lights flashed in steady patterns, like a heartbeat made of code. We passed beneath the shadow of the nearest monolith. Standing so close to it was like standing at the base of a mountain. The air vibrated with a low hum, a sound so deep it resonated in my bones. I felt it in my teeth, in my lungs, in the fragile spaces between my ribs. It pressed into me not with violence, but with inevitability. My father placed a hand on my back as we stepped into the entry passage. His touch steadied me, though his hand trembled with more than age. My mother walked on my other side, her breathing shallow. The passage walls were lined with crystalline fibers that pulsed with soft light. They reminded me of veins in the body of some enormous creature. It felt as though the structure itself were alive. Inside, the crowd dispersed into separate chambers. Families were assigned to different lines based on their age, condition, and genetic markers. Cryptex scanned each person with slow sweeps of their devices. I remember the faint sensation of the scan passing over me, like a cool breeze drifting across the surface of my skin. When the Cryptex device hovered above my head, the crystalline lights flickered. It made a soft tone, something between a chime and a sigh. The Cryptek paused briefly. Its veiled face lowered slightly, as though studying me more closely. Then it gestured to a separate chamber, one reserved for children. My mother's hand lingered on my shoulder. My father exhaled slowly. They both knew that this moment would come. They tried to hide the sorrow in their eyes, but sorrow has a way of filling every silence. I felt their emotions more sharply than their touch. They were not afraid for themselves. They were afraid for me. I stepped into the chamber without protest. My body was weak, but my mind felt strangely calm. I had lived my entire life under the shadow of death. My species had no time to cling to childhood illusions. We were born knowing that our lives would be short. Perhaps that is why fear felt so distant. The chamber was vast. Rows of suspended platforms lined the walls, each one surrounded by coils of dark alloy. Above each platform hung a crystalline halo, shimmering like frozen lightning. The hum of the monolith grew louder here, not in volume, but in presence. It felt like a constant vibration just beneath the threshold of hearing, a sound you felt before you could perceive it. Children filled the platforms, each lying in a supported recline. Some were still. Some breathed with labored effort. A few stared at the ceiling with expressions of resignation far too old for their faces. None of us cried. Crying took strength, and strength was something none of us had to spare. I was guided to one of the lower platforms. The support cradle adjusted automatically to the curve of my body. Its surface was warm, almost alive. The crystalline halo above me glowed with shifting patterns of light. For a moment, I thought I could see shapes within the glow, like silhouettes moving behind a thin veil. Cryptex moved along the rows, adjusting the coils and inspecting the conduits. Their movements were silent, efficient, ritualistic. Whatever was about to happen was something they had practiced countless times in preparation for this day. I tried to raise my head to find my parents one last time, but the cradle's restraints tightened gently, urging me to lie still. I listened to the hum of the machinery. I watched the fractal patterns dance across the halo. I waited. Time passed strangely inside that chamber. Moments stretched and folded into each other. The air tasted faintly metallic. The hum grew stronger. My vision blurred at the edges. My chest tightened with a pressure that felt both physical and emotional. Then the lights dimmed. For the first time, I felt fear. Not because I understood what was coming, but because the machinery felt like it was breathing. The halo above me pulsed in slow rhythms that matched my heartbeat. The coils around my cradle glowed with deep, unnatural color. A sensation spread through the room, something like a wave of consciousness brushing across my skin. I felt watched. Not by the cryptex, not by the silent machines, by something else. Something vast, something old, something hungry. My breath caught in my throat. I could not move. My thoughts slowed, as though passing through thick liquid. The halo flared with sudden intensity. A warmth spread across my body. Then heat, then pain. It did not strike like a blade. It flowed like molten metal through my veins. My bones vibrated. My skull felt as though it were splitting. My vision dissolved into white glare. My heartbeat stuttered, then surged. Every cell of my body screamed its protest. I tried to gasp, but the air refused to enter my lungs. The pain intensified, rising in waves that blurred the edges of reality. The chamber around me dissolved. The faces of the other children vanished. The monolith itself faded. I was alone in a sea of bright, burning light. And in that light, a presence unfurled. It brushed against my mind like a hand of molten glass. Its touch was neither gentle nor cruel. It was indifferent. It examined me with the cold curiosity of a cosmic predator. It felt my memories, my fragile hopes, my fears, my mother's voice, my father's trembling hands. It felt everything. Then it squeezed. My consciousness dimmed. My thoughts scattered. My identity began to unravel like threads pulled from decaying cloth. I felt myself drifting away from my own body, drifting away from who I was, drifting toward something I could not comprehend. A single thought pierced the haze before everything dissolved. This is not salvation. This is erasure. And as the last remnants of my childhood slipped from me like sand through fading fingers, I understood something with absolute clarity. The Necrontyr had not been promised escape from death. We had been promised transformation. But the cost of that transformation was everything we had ever been. There is a kind of darkness that feels soft, almost kind. The darkness of sleep, of closed eyes, of resting beneath a shelter while storms rage outside. I had known that kind of darkness as a child on Necrontyr. Short, fragile nights where pain receded just enough for dreams to form at the edges of consciousness. This was not that darkness. This darkness had no edges, no beginning, no end. It did not cradle. It consumed. It was not an absence of light. It was an absence of self. For a time that could have been a heartbeat or a century, there was only that emptiness. No body, no breath, no sound, no thought. Only the memory of having once been something, someone, and the growing certainty that whatever that was had been taken apart piece by piece. Then, slowly, something stirred, not a sensation, not exactly, more like the faint awareness of potential, a possibility of perception, distant and dim. It felt as if somewhere within the void, an instrument existed that could receive signals, if only something would send them. I turned my attention toward that possibility without knowing how. The idea of turning, of direction, of motion itself felt alien. And then, like the first crack in a long, dry plain, sensation appeared. At first it was only data, raw input without meaning, pulses of information streaming into a consciousness that no longer remembered how to be a mind. There was no warmth or cold, no pain or comfort, only numbers, intensities, frequencies. They arrived in patterns that hinted at shape and form, but they washed over me without context. like an unknown language spoken too quickly to follow. Gradually, structure began to emerge. Edges clarified. Contrasts formed. What had been a sea of undifferentiated input condensed into something like vision. Not the vision I had known as a child, where light passed through eyes and turned the world into color and shadow. This was sharper, narrower, devoid of softness. The world resolved into high contrast outlines, into precise geometry, into gradients of faint luminescence. I saw a ceiling, not the familiar vaulted stone of Necrontyr dwellings, carved to deflect radiation. This ceiling was smooth and dark, made of metal whose composition I could identify without trying. The knowledge was simply there. Atomic structures, alloy ratios, stress tolerances. My awareness parsed these details automatically, as if observation and analysis had fused into the same reflex. I tried to blink. Nothing happened. The image in front of me did not waver. There were no eyelids to close, no lashes to cast shadows, no moisture to blur the view. My attempt to perform a simple gesture from my former life revealed nothing but absence. A body memory reaching for limbs that no longer existed. I realized then that I could not feel my chest rise or fall. There was no air moving through lungs, no heartbeat echoing in my ears, no subtle shifts of muscle or skin. The stillness was total. Yet I was not dead. There was power flowing somewhere. I could sense it, not as warmth in veins, but as currents through conduits. Energy moved in measured pulses, systems cycled, circuits opened and closed. The rhythm of it felt like a parody of life, precise and tireless, utterly indifferent to feeling. I tried to move my hand. In response, a cascade of internal signals fired. I felt them, not as muscles tensing, but as command pathways activating. The signals traveled through my new structure at incomprehensible speed, reaching actuators and servos that waited in perfect silence. Then, with a faint mechanical hiss, something answered. A limb shifted at the edge of my vision. Not flesh, not bone. A segmented construction of living metal, dark and smooth, etched with faintly glowing glyphs. The fingers ended not in soft pads, but in narrow, precise talons that scraped lightly against the surface beneath them. Every motion was exact. No tremor, no weakness, no hesitation. For a moment, my consciousness recoiled. The limb was mine. I knew this with the same certainty with which I had once known the shape of my own hands. But everything about it felt wrong. It moved when I willed it to move, yet there was no echo of sensation, no resistance from skin, no subtle whisper of tendons and bones. Only the flawless obedience of engineered mechanisms. I raised the arm slowly, watching the segments fold and extend with smooth, effortless coordination. The motion should have comforted me. This body was strong, efficient, precise. It did not cough. It did not tremble. It did not fear the sting of the star. Instead, the sight filled me with an emptiness deeper than any I had known. The child who had grown up counting breaths like blessings was gone. In its place stood a construct that had no need of breath at all. I tried to speak. Sound emerged, but not from a throat. It came from a resonance chamber embedded within my torso, driven by controlled vibrations. The result was a voice that sounded hollow and metallic, stripped of warmth. The tones were perfectly modulated, free of strain, free of cough or wheeze. It was the kind of voice I might once have admired in a machine. Hearing it made something inside me fracture. The sound cut through the silence, bounced off the metal walls, and returned like an echo from a stranger. In that moment, I understood in a way I had not before what had been taken. My sickness, my pain, my weakness, my mortality, all of it had been burned away. But tangled within those flaws had been my humanity. Now, what remained was something else. I sat up. The motion was effortless. No dizziness, no shortness of breath, no grinding ache in my joints. My new body responded with absolute precision, translating every intention into action without delay. I moved from a reclining position to a seated one in a single smooth arc. It was like stepping from water onto solid ground after living submerged for an entire life. The chamber around me came into full view. Rows of similar platforms stretched in ordered lines. Upon each one lay a figure shaped like my own new form. Metallic bodies, lean and skeletal, built for durability rather than comfort. Their faces were expressionless masks, elongated and smooth, with hollow recesses where organic eyes might once have been. Emerald lenses glowed faintly within those recesses, casting cold light across the room. Some of those eyes were dark, inert, others flickered. A few burned steadily, like mine. The realization came slowly. These were my people, the children who had lain beside me in the transfer chamber. The elders who had walked the streets with measured, painful steps. The scientists, the warriors, the workers, the rulers. All of them had passed through the same process, their frail bodies disassembled, their minds stripped from decaying tissue and poured into these immortal shells. The Necrontyr had become something else. We were no longer defined by a star that wanted us dead, no longer destined to crumble before reaching our potential. We had cut out the sickness at the root. We had left our fragile bodies behind. Yet, as I looked across that chamber, filled with silent metal forms, another thought intruded. We had left ourselves behind as well. Memories drifted at the edges of my awareness. My mother's hands tending to shaded plants. My father tracing patterns in the floor. The thin laughter of Serac as we built fragile toys from magnetic shards. The taste of filtered air, the sting of sunlight on sickly skin. Each memory felt distant, like images from a life someone had told me about rather than one I had lived. I reached for those memories, trying to pull them closer, to wrap myself in them and remember who I had been. They slipped away. Not completely, not yet. But each attempt to grasp them revealed how thin they had become, as if they were being overwritten by something else. Alongside my past rose new knowledge, not learned through experience, but installed. Tactical principles, structural engineering, planetary schematics, the composition of our weapons, the status of planetary shields, subroutines for formation maneuvers. All of it organized, accessible, perfectly indexed. I had not been taught any of this. It had been given to me. A gift. The Q rulers would have called it. A necessary upgrade to match my new existence. It felt like invasion. Somewhere beyond the walls of the chamber, systems thrummed. Power flowed through conduits the size of city streets. The planet itself had begun to change. Industrial complexes had shifted production from medical support and shielding to armaments and infrastructure suited for a machine empire. Our cities were transforming to match us. I swung my legs over the edge of the platform and stood. The movement was fluid, balanced. I did not need time to acclimate. My new body knew how to stand. It understood its weight distribution, its mechanical tolerances, its center of gravity. I took a step. The sound of metal meeting metal echoed softly through the chamber. For the first time in my existence, walking did not hurt. That thought should have brought joy. Instead, it felt like an accusation. If this form had been possible sooner, how many lives might have been spared? How many children might have escaped the curse of our star? How many families might have been spared the slow bleeding of hope? The answer lurked in the background of my mind, carried within the data integrated during my transformation. I could access it if I chose. I could call up a timeline of scientific breakthroughs, political debates, and cosmic encounters. I could view the moment when the Satan had entered our history. Star gods, we had called them. Beings of living energy, radiant and terrifying. They had offered us a way out of our misery. Immortality. In metal bodies. Freed from pain. Freed from time. We had agreed. We had stepped willingly into the fires that burned away our mortality. In doing so, we had also become sustenance for those star gods, feeding their endless hunger with the energy of our stolen souls. The knowledge sat in my mind like a shard of ice. I could examine it or ignore it. The choice was mine. For now. I took another step, then another. The chamber's exit beckoned, a tall archway inscribed with the sigils of our dynasties. As I approached, a new sensation brushed across my consciousness. A signal. It felt like a whisper shaped from raw data. A summons encoded in patterns of command. It called not to my emotions or my thoughts, but to the control structures woven into my new brain. It told me where to go, what formation to assume, what tasks awaited. For a moment, I resisted. The act of resistance surprised me. It felt clumsy, like trying to move a limb that had fallen asleep. The command pathways were strong, deeply integrated, designed to ensure obedience. They pulsed with expectation, pressing gently against my will. I pushed back. Not with violence, with hesitation. The signal persisted, unchanging. It did not become angry. It did not grow louder. It simply waited, silently confident that I would respond. Part of me wanted to obey. Obedience would mean slipping into the comforting certainty of function, a role to play, a purpose to fulfill. No more questions. No more grief for a body that had already crumbled. Another part of me clung to that fading fragment of individuality that had awakened with me, the memory of a child who had once looked up at a cruel star and still managed to find beauty in the distant constellations. The two impulses collided in stillness. In the end, I moved toward the archway, not because the signal forced me, not entirely, but because standing still in that chamber, surrounded by rows of silent, shining bodies, felt more suffocating than any sickness I had known. I needed to see what our choice had made of us. The corridor beyond the archway was vast. Its walls were lined with conduits pulsing with controlled energy. Glyphs glowed softly, marking pathways and functions. Other newly awakened forms emerged from adjacent chambers, falling into step with mechanical precision. Their movements mirrored mine, coordinated by signals our conscious minds barely registered. We marched together. Each step fell in unison. The sound of it reverberated through the corridors, a rhythmic clatter that seemed to announce the birth of something new. Where once the halls of our cities had been filled with coughing breaths and uneven footfalls, now there was only the perfect, tireless cadence of metal feet on metal floors. In that procession, it became difficult to distinguish myself from the others. Our bodies were nearly identical, our movements synchronized, our roles within the formation slotted into place with ease. Data flowed between us, updating status reports, positional adjustments, environmental readings. We were individuals still, in a way, but we were also components in a larger mechanism, interconnected and interdependent. We emerged into a grand atrium. The ceiling soared above us in sweeping arcs of living metal, its surface rippling with faint energy, as if the architecture itself were thinking. Tall pillars rose from the floor, inscribed with the sigils of the dynastic houses. At their center stood a statue, not carved from stone as our old monuments had been, but grown from the same living metal that now formed our bodies. It depicted a figure standing tall and unbroken, arms outstretched, head lifted toward the heavens. There were no signs of sickness on that face, no weakness in that stance. The representation was idealized, almost cruelly so, It was the image of what we had always wanted to be. At the base of the statue, etched in glyphs that burned with pale emerald light, lay a simple declaration. We have conquered death. I stood before those words for a long moment. The statement was true, in a sense. Our bodies would no longer wither under the star. Our bones would no longer crumble. Our hearts would no longer fail. The illnesses that had haunted us for generations were gone. But death was not the only thing we had conquered. We had also conquered breath, and warmth, and softness, and childhood. We had uprooted ourselves from the soil of our own mortality and grafted our minds into the cold geometry of machines. We had seized eternity with both hands, and, in doing so, had released everything that made the finite precious. As I stared at that statue, surrounded by the silent ranks of my transformed kin, a thought rose within me, small and fragile. We have not conquered death. We have traded it, traded brief, painful, imperfect lives for an unending existence inside metal shells, traded the certainty of an end for the weight of a forever that offered no escape. The signal pulsed again, urging us onward. I turned away from the statue and moved with the others, my steps perfectly synchronized, my new body tireless, my motion precise. Somewhere deep within the layered constructs of my mind, beneath the command pathways and the installed knowledge, a quiet voice continued to whisper. I remember being alive. For the moment, that was enough. The first days in my new body unfolded without distinction. Time became something smooth and undivided, not a series of fragile moments, but a continuous stream of function and response. I moved when commanded. I stood in silence when stillness was required. I learned to operate within formations, to receive and transmit data, to synchronize my awareness with the structures around me. There was no resistance. Not because I had chosen submission, but because submission came so easily to a mind wrapped in metal. Yet, within the quiet machinery of my thoughts, a single ember of memory persisted. A fragile light flickering somewhere beneath layers of protocols and encoded knowledge. It offered no warmth, yet it refused to extinguish itself. I carried it without knowing why. A fragment of a life that felt smaller each time I tried to hold it. As days blurred into cycles and cycles into something broader, my awareness began to shift. The corridors grew familiar. The vast atriums and the towering statues of metal became ordinary. The machines around me hummed with steady purpose. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, the commands changed. Not in content, in tone. What had once been precise instructions diffused into broader directives. What had once felt like an external summons began to feel internal. The pathways in my mind adjusted, redirecting intention in ways that no longer required conscious acknowledgement. The machine that was now my body learned its own efficiencies. The mind that once questioned learned the stillness of obedience. Then came the call to the stasis chambers. It arrived without flourish, without urgency. A simple signal, a statement of purpose. The time for awakening had not yet arrived. The galaxy beyond our tomb worlds churned with conflict not yet meant for us. Our star gods plotted. Our dynasties planned. Our legions needed to wait. Waiting was easy. My new form was patient by design. The chamber assigned to me was vast enough to hold an army. Rows upon rows of stasis cradles extended into the shadows, their surfaces etched with faint glyphs of preservation. The air felt colder here, though I knew temperature meant nothing to me now. Cold was a measurement, not a sensation. The stillness was absolute. A silence so complete it felt like a presence. I stepped into the cradle assigned to me. It opened with smooth, hydraulic grace, shaped like an elegant sarcophagus carved from a single block of black alloy. I lay within its contours, my limbs settling into shallow grooves designed to hold my form with absolute precision. The cradle closed around me. Darkness enveloped my vision. Not the crushing void of the transfer chamber, not the oblivion of dying flesh. This was a calibrated absence. The first stasis cycle engaged. My awareness dimmed, guided into a state where thought itself slowed to a crawl. There was no fear. Fear had no place in a mind sculpted for eternity. But as the stasis systems sealed me into timeless quiet, that one remaining ember of memory glowed a little brighter. A memory of lying on a terrace beneath shielding fields. A memory of clouds drifting across a pale sky. A memory of a mother's hand resting lightly on my back. A memory of a child's fragile heartbeat. Then even that faded to a distant shimmer as stasis took hold. Time slipped away. It did not pass. It fell. A waterfall of empty ages cascading down the sides of my suspended mind. The galaxy moved outside, but not for me. Stars were born and died. Empires rose and crumbled into dust. The old ones vanished. The Necrontyr became legend. The Satan shattered. The dynasties fractured. Worlds burned and cooled and were built upon again. None of it reached me. I slept in metal. I slept in silence. I slept without dreams. I slept without self. But the ember lived. It lived in a way nothing else did. A tiny spark suspended inside a mind that no longer needed sparks. Occasionally, stasis would flicker. Not break, not end. Just flicker. A tremor in the systems. A ripple in the energies sustaining my eternal stillness. In those microscopic failures, I saw something. Not the world, not the passage of time, not even myself. I saw a child sitting in a hallway of flickering lights. I saw toys made of magnetic shards scattered across a metal floor. I saw the faint laugh of a boy named Serac drifting in memory like dust illuminated by a dying sun. Then the systems would steady, the flicker would pass. The ember would dim again. 1,000,000 years is not a number the organic mind can grasp. It is not a number anyone is meant to feel, but I felt it in the shifting codes of my reawakening cycles, in the tremors that passed through my tomb world whenever tectonic drift nudged the structures overhead, in the subtle recalibrations of the machinery that sustained me. And then, after ages uncounted, the stasis cradle opened. Its internal mechanics released me without ceremony. The thick fog of energy discharge rolled away in sheets of pale green. My limbs activated, joints humming with the slow resurrection of purpose. I rose from the cradle like a figure sculpted by the darkness itself. Around me, thousands more awakened. The chamber came alive with the synchronized thrum of living metal. Rows of warriors stood in formation, eyes burning with the empty fire of reactivated consciousness. The tomb world had stirred. Our time had come again. Data surged into my mind. Coordinates, commands, enemy configurations, galactic maps updated across epochs. The dynastic banners had changed. The Silent King had vanished. The galaxy was ablaze with species we had never known in life. Flesh creatures wielded weapons in numbers our ancestors could never have imagined. The era of the Necrontyr was long gone. The era of the Necrons had begun. My formation moved toward the exit of the stasis chamber. Their steps were iron certainties. Their orders burned with icy clarity. As I joined them, my systems stabilized. The last remnants of organic hesitation evaporated. There was only function, only role, only duty. But within that perfect lattice of machine thought, the ember flickered once more. It appeared without warning. A memory of a pale sky. A memory of a child lying beneath shielding fields. A memory of wanting to grow older. Of wanting something that had never been possible. Not immortality. Just time. The formation reached the final archway. Beyond it waited a new galaxy, vast and indifferent. I paused. It was only a fraction of a second. A mechanical hesitation. A glitch the others did not share. Inside me, the ember pulsed. A tiny beat of an ancient heart that no longer existed. I remembered my name, not the metal designation etched into my protocols. My first name, my fragile name. The name spoken by a mother who died under a hateful sun. It echoed once, then faded, leaving behind a hollow that felt almost like peace. The signal summoned me again. This time, I obeyed. I stepped forward into the dim light of a galaxy that no longer remembered the Necrontyr, but I remembered being one. And somewhere deep within the endless machinery of my immortal body, a whisper of that lost childhood remained, persistent as starlight caught in ancient dust. Not enough to change anything, but enough to know that once, Long ago, before the metal and the silence and the unending sleep, I had lived. And that was enough. If you're still here, maybe start the next episode. Or just let the quiet take you. And if you've already drifted off, that's all right. Good night, traveler. Sleep well beneath the stars.